Today I'm speaking with Emily Hedrick. Emily, thank you so much for joining me today.
So glad to be here.
I'm going to give a brief bio for Emily. She lives in Weymouth, Massachusetts, and she's a health and wellness coach for compassion, fatigue, and religious trauma at Emily Hedrick Coaching and Consulting, if I can say it correctly. There is a link beneath our video if you want to go check it out, and some other links to her Facebook page as well. Some really cool stuff there. She grew up in a Mennonite area of southeastern Pennsylvania in a town called Telford. I actually am familiar with a little bit of that area. I actually went to
Oh,
Lancaster Bible College and
okay.
got family in Lancaster. So I did a lot of Bible quizzing with Mennonites too. And
Mm.
she grew up in a fundamentalist evangelical Mennonite denomination called Mennonite Church USA. I'm sure we'll touch on that in a little bit. She went to Goshen College, majoring in Bible, religion, and music. She earned her Master's of Divinity at Wake Forest University School of Divinity and subsequently became a pastor in the Mennonite Church. She has served as a program director for Journey Free, which is Marlene Winnell's organization, and she's the author of True Confessions of a God Killer, a postmodern pilgrim's progress. So I want to hear about that at some point. And that's what I know about you so far. What else should we know about you, Emily?
Well, I if you wanna know more rounded things about me, I absolutely love to cook and I love to have people over. So just this weekend, actually, I had some friends visiting, friends from college come to visit, and I made an Ethiopian meal and learned how to. I don't even know. I'm not going to say it right, but I learned how to make the bread, the bubbly bread that's like super spongy. I'm still working on my technique, but I think it turned out all right.
Nice.
So that's one thing that I really enjoy doing too.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Very cool. And do you like Ethiopian food in general, or specifically, or just food in general? To
Just food in general. I really enjoy making things. Actually, that one came out of the part of the Mennonite trilogy of cookbooks. I still use Mennonite cookbooks all the time.
nice.
Um, and that one's called Extending the Table. It's a bunch of recipes for people that have, from people that have done mission work all over the world, and it's quite a collection.
Well,
Um,
that's awesome.
yeah.
I'm in that stage of life with four small children, age 8 and under, where like sometimes I want to do some kind of specialty cooking for them, but they're just
Oh,
like, Daddy, we just want mac and cheese. Like, okay.
yep.
So, but going back to your story, I did want to give you the ball to tell us your story. Start as early as you'd like and as early as you remember, and we'll just
Okay.
talk through it. And then I've got some questions toward the end we'll get through, but probably a lot of them you'll touch on naturally anyway. But I'll jump in here with some questions. But I'd love to hear just more about where your journey's been.
Well, nobody has asked me to start as early as I remember, but I do have a pretty specific memory of getting saved. I was 5, and my grandparents had taken me to a revival type meeting, and it was over. Well, I was 5, so it would have been 1996, I guess. So I must have gone to some other revival type meetings. There was something going on over the Y2K era of time, but this was different. And I remember at that point having a fairly positive view of God and spirituality, what you can gather as a 5-year-old, and then hearing this story about how I was bad and sinful, and that this was a problem that needed to be solved by me. Using the way I interpret it in my memory is that I had to use Jesus to get to God. And it was something that felt really out of sync for me because I was like, but I thought I was just supposed to be friends with Jesus. I just want to get to know Jesus. I want to be in a relationship with Jesus. I don't want to have to use him through this weird system that I don't understand, that sounds really scary, to make everything right. But I guess I should.
Hmm.
And, went with it as a lot of kids do because you trust adults and you're like, they know a lot more about this world than I do. I guess I'm going to go for this. And I remember my family, particularly my grandparents who had taken me to this, being so relieved and excited that I had done this. And when I think back on that story, it makes me really sad. Um, just because the things that they were afraid of, I may not actually know what they
Hmm.
would have been afraid of at that time. Um,
Did it include
but
hell?
yes, it definitely included hell.
Okay, a
And
literal burning hell.
yeah, I'm pretty sure. I don't know how graphic things got, but it wouldn't surprise me if they did. Like, 5-year-old memory is only so good.
Hmm.
Um,
Can I ask, do you remember the prayer you prayed, or anything about it, or just what it would have
there have
included?
been so many altar calls since then. It's probably a conglomeration of things, but like, dear Jesus, I have sinned and done wrong things, and I need you to forgive me and make me clean again. I believe in you, that kind of thing. That formula. It was a repeat after me kind of, the adult says the words first, you have your hand raised, all that good stuff.
Did they kind of celebrate once you had done it? Yeah, she's saved now.
Probably. It was also like, you have a few different kinds of altar calls. Like, people can get that individual attention, but then there's the let's push them through the factory as fast as we can. Everybody raise your hand and say the prayer. Good job. And then it's up to you if you want to get more support. But I was 5, so there was probably all kinds of children's programming around this. Like, who knows what the logistics were.
Yeah.
But I was alone, I think. It was kind of like a babysitting situation. This is how they get you, free babysitting. But that's what I remember. Who knows what actually happened?
That was the same age I did it as well. It's very much that sense of you're a sinner and you gotta have a savior.
Yeah. And by that point I had done some sinful things, like I stole a Reese's cup from the grocery store when I was 3 because it just seemed really inefficient to have to go through that grocery line, and I figured I'd just help people out. I just wanted that and I was just going to take it.
Nice.
But it kind of turned into this big moment of, and now we see you have original sin. I remember my dad kind of crying. As you go through that experience with kids, I imagine there is this sadness, but looking back on it and being like, oh, actually, if I look on this developmentally, it doesn't need it to be painted in and this means that you're inherently sinful. It's just like, I was exploring and didn't know how the world worked. But I got devious and crafty from that time.
With the other altar calls, were those to get saved, like you weren't sure you did it right, or were those more just recommitments?
Both.
Okay.
I think oftentimes people, at least in my experiences, people would be like, and if you've committed to Christ, but you haven't been following through and you're a lukewarm Christian, now's your time to recommit. And I do remember in camp, this would be much later in middle school, and this was Mennonite. I have no idea if that revival thing I went to was Mennonite or not. The area I was in was very heavily Mennonite, so it wouldn't surprise me. But I should say that Mennonite Church USA is not inherently fundamentalist. I would say they're evangelical because they want to be mission oriented. But the fact that I could pastor in that church is a sign that it's not fundamentalist.
Yeah, for sure.
Completely. It contains fundamentalist churches, or at least it has in the past. But anyway.
With their theology, can I ask, did you fear that you could lose your salvation? I don't know enough about Mennonite theology.
Good question. This is the trouble with Mennonites. People can have a variety of different experiences, and because, like, the big things that I learned were Mennonite by the time I was in middle school in my Mennonite private education, which is not the experience of all Mennonite children. I knew that we have a commitment to nonviolence, that we have a history of baptizing adults and not children, though that's not how it functions these days, but the idea that baptism is a choice and not something that is thrust upon you.
Right.
And this was a bit more complicated to me at the time, but I got the information that communion was a symbolic thing, purely symbolic. It was not the literal blood and body of Christ in any form at any point in that ritual. And so those are the things that came through, but you can put all kinds of theology around that. And that can include people I know people I grew up with that said the sinner's prayer over and over and over again obsessively because they were terrified that they might lose it. And I think some of that theology came through in our schooling, in the private school. And some of it came through in our congregations. And then there are other congregations that are much more progressive and liberal and social justice oriented, which is part of why I stayed so long. So there's this full spectrum in Mennonite Church USA of a variety of different ways of doing Christianity, and they all are kind of housed together, and it is very chaotic if you go exploring. If you stick in one church forever, then it might not be as jarring.
Can I ask you, you brought up something that, and I've heard in your other in your other interviews, you seem to be unnaturally able to be critical earlier in life than most people. And I was wondering, would you agree with that? I think you would. And what if that's so, why do you think you were? Because what I mean is, like, for most of us, there was, I think, chalk it up to indoctrination, naivety, sheltering, hyper sheltering, where everyone is a Christian and you only do Christian things. But like looking back, I could say from my deconversion backwards, there might have been red flags, but I wouldn't have chalked them up as red flags. Like, um, I didn't think there's something wrong with my worldview until the very end when I deconverted. It sounded like you kind of saw some red flags and actually would have, labeled them as like, this is an issue. What caused you to be different?
Um, there would be a few different factors. I think the first is my Mennonite heritage makes things more complicated. And part of that is that spectrum I mentioned, that really inherently in the denomination, there is room for all of that, which means you can run into all of that. So the information control.
Is that your dog? What's her name?
Alice.
Alice. Very nice.
Now she's going to mess with her bed for a little bit.
What breed is she?
She is an Australian Shepherd Rough Collie mix.
Oh, nice. Nice. I just need to get some sheep and
yeah,
and herd them around.
When I was living in Ohio, we lived next to a family with 5 Chihuahua mixes of some kind that were in a fenced-in yard, and she would run up and down the fence, yelling at them, barking at them.
Oh no!
And it was, I think she enjoyed it, but it also felt like it was stressful for everyone. But
Yeah.
they had fun.
Awesome.
We were talking about why I could be critical when I was so young. Some of it comes from the environment of having not as much information control because of that whole spectrum existent in the same denomination. And really, within that tight-knit community of Mennonites, you had the churches like right next to each other or within 5-10 minutes of each other and going to the same private schools. And so there was a little bit more information flow as a result of that. I'll also attribute it to my parents, and some of that, there's the cultural aspect of Mennonites, you would think would make things more insular, and there are some ways in which it does, but there are also ways in which it expands things. My mother's family, I found out later, is not the full-bred Mennonite of the area that I grew up in. And so there was always this feeling of being slightly out of the in crowd. And it was religiously oriented. And we just weren't part of the immigration wave of the people where we were living. Her father's family went to Ohio first and then came to Pennsylvania later. And they may have immigrated a little bit later and for different reasons. And it's strange going into these Mennonite communities and getting these weird gut feelings about who belongs and who doesn't. And I didn't know this until I was an adult, but I started asking questions and I was like, why do we always feel like we were sort of out, like sort of not part of the right crowd? And I think that has a part to play. My dad's family also doesn't have a traditional Mennonite name. And if I look at the background, he would have come from more Reformed and then converted. I later found out that his dad converted, or no, his grandfather, I believe, married a Mennonite and then just came into the fold. And so do
you want a Stoltzfus?
Right. Yeah. I wasn't a Stoltzfus. I could trace some Yoder's back. Like I've got some of the right Mennonite names, but the main people influencing my family and my experience that, you find out if you're not, you pay more attention to if you're not in the in group. Right. Even if you have little traces of it. We humans do that in many situations. So I think that identity played into it too of, well, we never really were fully acceptable, so we might as well start criticizing some of this now. And then the other thing is probably just the nature of my parents in general. My dad was a chaplain. He had an MDiv, and he didn't necessarily, he got it from, did he go to Eastern? I can't remember. But anyway, he was not going to a Bible college for it. And so it was a little bit more of a progressive approach to things. And he was carrying that for quite some time. And so that also, he knew to not stifle questioning. Like I think a lot of kids are naturally questioning until it becomes a survival need to not be. And both of my parents were able to celebrate the ways that I asked questions. And so I didn't tone it down.
That's awesome.
Even though that might have helped me out at points.
That's such a critical point. I love it.
Yeah.
I feel like that's a big part of my picture of my story with both my parents as well as just pastors, the church, Sunday school teachers, Bible college teachers. It's like there was so much more you all could have told me about. Like, why didn't you tell me this and that? And then um, that list that was kind of part of my. I tell people it's part of my second level of deconversion was there were issues, but there was also this issue of why didn't you all tell me that there were these issues? Like,
Mm-hmm.
why is
Mm-hmm.
there a secret?
Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm, that's great. So your parents were supportive of your questioning. Did you ever ask any questions where they were um, either hesitant to answer or to say, you know what, let's not deal with that one too much, or just how far could you push the buttons?
Not as I never I don't have any memories of going too far with my parents as a child.
Hmm,
When I went through my first round of deconstruction, I started talking about, hey, I think God might be evil, and that was a little much. um,
hmm. But
but
I want to definitely come back to that when we get to that point in the
yeah,
story for sure.
yeah.
So when you were doing this, I know I saw in your other interviews you talked about wanting to be a pastor as early as age 9.
Hmm.
How did I mean, that's ironically kind of similar to my story too. Although being a white male, it was much more acceptable. But like, how did you progress from just being saved at 5 to wanting to be a pastor at 9? And my next big question would be, how in the world was that received when you started to proclaim that publicly?
Well, so our church went through a transition when I was 9, and so I saw that pastors could change in that
Mhm.
time, and they were on a pastoral search. And that contributed to me having a dream, I think, of me preaching at the pulpit. And that was kind of my first, oh, yeah, I want to preach. But I do think as I look back on that whole experience, that deep down as a child, I didn't feel like people were hearing me.
Mhm.
And a pulpit, if someone's behind a pulpit, that means they listen to you, right? That means you can say what needs to be said. You can make your observations that nobody's listening to you about when you're not behind the pulpit. And change can happen. I think that was a story that I latched on to.
Mhm.
And is not totally true, I discovered.
Yeah, but you felt
So
like
I
you had
think,
things to say.
yeah, I was precocious as a kid, and so I also like I could tell when adults were treating me like a kid, and I didn't like it. I wanted them to be serious with me. I had questions and ideas and things I wanted to talk about, and the adults all just wanted to talk to each other. I get this now to a certain extent, though I do think we could do better at explaining to our children what's going on instead of just pushing them to the side.
Yeah, like being
Um,
relegated to the kids' table at Thanksgiving.
Right, right. It's like, hey, can we be intergenerational for a second? Can we like take into account where everybody's at in their development and be like, we are all still humans together. You're just really short and doing some brain processes here. Um, but when I proclaimed that I wanted to be a pastor, I think when I first had the dream, it was kind of like, oh yeah, you're 9, but yeah, sure, from my parents, and I didn't really tell other people. When I was older, I went through this period of I don't want to do that to my family, my future family, that there's so much trouble that comes from having to be a woman and pastoring, and people are mean to you, and it messes with your finances and all that stuff. And actually, at one point, kind of put out my fleece and said, okay, God, if you want me to be a pastor, then you got to have a lot of people tell me in the next week that I should be a pastor. And I have 4 people unprovoked um, mention, hey, have you ever thought of being a pastor? It seems like that would be really good for you.
Wow,
Um, so,
that's crazy. It's like
yeah,
it's like a sign from heaven.
if you're looking for it, you see it, right? Um, this is my new cognitive reconstruction. Um, so that was when I was in high school, and there were a few different. So the big story that I often tell is when I asked to preach a sermon in my home church, knowing that they would say no. And a few things, instead of focusing on that particular experience in this interview, I'll focus on what happened from my broader community, from the broader Mennonites that are a different place on the spectrum than the church I grew up in. A few things happened. One, I did have the support of my choir director at one point, who was just celebrating my leadership skills in a variety of ways and was very caring. I also had an English teacher who actually gave me at the time, he was into transparencies and cassettes. He probably still is, but gave me a cassette tape of a recording of an interview that another high school student had done with their pastor about what it's like to be a pastor, and was saying, hey, we need our brightest and best to be leading the church. You are that. Like, really seriously think about this. We need you. And I also had another teacher who had heard my story in one of the classes that I had with him come up to me after chapel one day. And I already had the trauma of, when men come up to ask me about something, it's because they're telling me I did something wrong and overstepped my bounds, and was afraid that he was going to tell me I needed to do something differently, and that I had. And this is the thing, I wasn't afraid of punishment. I was afraid that I hurt people. That was kind of the story that was woven through, of you being who you are hurts other people, and you need to monitor that, is often what I got.
Because of your interest in being a leader in the church?
Yeah, and just some of the natural qualities that come from that. Like, when we talk about the words feisty and bossy seemingly only applied to women, that this idea of, well, I was just being myself and inhabiting this gender in society, and therefore it became threatening or problematic. Like, there was a time when I was in youth group and got into an argument with the youth pastor about dying for your faith versus living for it, which one is harder? And I was starting to make the argument of, well, living takes a long time. It doesn't, like, you can die in a moment for your faith, but if you're really living it out, that's a lot of work. And got into this whole argument with him, and later was chastised by somebody I trusted to say, you don't want to make a pastor look like that. You don't want to make them look bad. Like, you're a woman, you're a lot younger than him, even if you're right. It's not a good idea. And to this day, I don't know if he was telling me that out of strategy or out of morality, of you shouldn't have done that, or listen, I hear you, but don't do that for your own good. So anyway, I had a teacher come up to me after class, or after chapel, and say, hey, I wanted to talk to you. And I was like, okay. And he said, our church is actually needing people for pulpit fill. Would you be interested? And I was so like, oh, wow. oh, huh. And I said no, because I was just too intimidated by the whole thing and was a little bit raw. But that was the kind of environment I grew up in. It's very, you'd think in some ways it's advantageous because there's so many other options available. In other ways, it's chaotic and very confusing. And that's how the world works.
It's interesting as a side parallel to what you were saying a few minutes ago, but I was interviewing someone a while ago. It was probably a good year ago, and she was a worship leader, like with the songs and so forth. And she had the issue where she was just naturally very curvy, and she would get pulled aside and say, "You're becoming a distraction just purely because of your physical, attractiveness or whatever." And she was like literally not doing anything outrageous or anything, or dressing provocatively. She just had curves, and she had to, I think, step away eventually because people were literally distracted from the worship because of her beauty or whatever. And it was really weird to me to think, like, that's really toxic to say, just because of who you are, like you were talking about it in a different sense, but just because of inherently you being a woman, you're disqualified from being up front for all these different reasons. I don't know, well, there's more to it than that from people who want to quote scripture, but even just socially, like, it's just not what we do. We don't want that. It's weird.
Yeah, it is. I got a little bit of that when I was pastoring. And it's different dynamics when you're a pastor and someone corners you in your office to tell you that they know more about your clothes than you do, and that you need to dress more modestly. Like, this is one of the things that has frustrated me a lot about the deconstruction world, is that everybody assumes pastors are male and rich and exploitative. And what they don't realize is that the majority of churches in the United States are very small. The pastors are not paid well at all. And many of them are women. In this day and age, many of them are women. Women have gotten the leftovers from everything that is dying now.
Interesting.
And what is terrifying about that, what I experienced in my pastoral care classes in grad school, was this, hey, you need to trust the wisdom of the congregation. Don't think you know everything. These people have been Christians so much longer than you. And a lot of that is really helpful for white straight men that have been privileged their whole lives, that don't realize how haughty they can be in these settings and think they know all of the answers and whatever. It's really helpful for them to get that information. But when you say that to women, it can turn into people who have already been socialized to not trust themselves or to put others first at all costs. I'm sitting in my office with a man trying to tell me that my clothing is provocative to him, and thinking, holy shit, where's the door? I'm in danger right now. This man is obsessed with my body. This feels like rape culture. And it's very primal, whether or not it was actually true. I know that he was not, about to do anything. And yet this is the situation we're in. And I'm telling myself, no, I'm the one in the power position here. I need to be very careful about how I approach these power dynamics. I need to listen to this person first. I need to take care of them. And it's just twisted and messed up. And these are things that I think a lot of people don't think about when women become pastors. Yes, there is power to it. And on the other side, I'm still a woman.
Right.
And so.
While we're on the topic, this may be a quick aside, but is purity culture a big issue in the Mennonite Church, or how does it differ from? Okay.
This was a large part of my story. And again, it depends on the church. There's a wide spectrum of how people approach purity culture, or if people even know to call it that. Right. I grew up very heavy purity culture, and also had a little bit of influence from one of my friends, childhood friends growing up. Her dad is in charge of a Christian media company. And so we watched the abstinence only videos and gave them reviews when we were middle schoolers. So I got it pretty bad.
What was the rule for the length of the skirt? How low did it have to go?
In my high school, it was fingertips. I think it was the fingertips rule. And I think it needed to be
above the knee,
bit below your fingertips.
Above the knee?
Yeah, if it was above the knee, it needed to be below your fingertips.
Okay. Yeah. But the reason I ask is I remember my experience with Bible quizzing. Most of the Mennonite girls that I remember, they were wearing them to their ankles. Almost, I would say 90% of them were all the way down to the ankles.
Well, and some of that depends on the region you're in and which denomination. I don't know if they would have been MCUSA.
Yeah, I'm not sure. They felt to me like
an MCUSA, and it was okay. So that's very different than.
Yeah, this felt like very, very, at least culturally. I don't know if it was religiously, theologically conservative, but it was very socially conservative.
Yeah.
They probably also were living very close to Amish, so there may have been some influence there too.
Right. Yeah.
So you're in this group where you're kind of feeling out if you're allowed to be a woman in leadership.
Mm-hmm.
Did you sense that, not in the sense of the culture, but just between you and God? Did you feel like this was where he was actually calling you to, you mentioned the 4 people that told you that, you should consider it? Did you feel like this was definitely like a destiny of sorts?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
It's really hard to remember what it was like when I was relating to God now.
Yeah.
But I do believe, I had to have believed that God was calling me to that at the time. Yes.
And you, in terms of theology, when you looked at the scriptures that talked about women being silent in the churches, did you feel like you had thought through and had answers to the theological objections?
Oh, yes. I could give lectures on it when I was in high school.
Okay.
We found a few books. My mom taught me a few techniques for exegeting things. And really the first time I found one of those passages was because someone mentioned it to my friends when they were in baptism class, and they got into the classic theological arguments that you win by putting the most scripture behind your argument. And so they were showing them the scripture, and I hadn't even known those scriptures existed at that time. I read a lot of the Bible. I read the whole thing actually at a certain point, but you skim over parts. But I was shocked when I encountered that scripture for the first time. And so, but yeah, we dealt with it. And I also remember at the time, it took me a little bit longer to get to a more progressive position on homosexuality, what we called it. And I remember the first time I exegeted a passage trying to figure out the whole women thing, that I did say to myself, this would have been in 7th grade. I said to myself, well, if I'm going to be okay with women being pastors, I better be okay with LGBTQ stuff. I wouldn't have used that language at the time, because it's the same principle. It's all about exegesis. And eventually I forgot about that little conversation I had with myself because I needed to in order to be okay.
Mm.
But I came back pretty quick.
Was the Mennonite church then that you were in, they were fairly accepting?
Of women?
No,
Of
of people in the LGBTQ plus community?
No,
Okay.
they weren't. Though updates, they just made some big statements this past summer where not only did they celebrate the existence and lives of LGBTQ people, but have voiced a desire to repent from the ways they had harmed LGBTQ. Like they've admitted it on a corporate level. Go into individual churches and you're going to get different stories.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's a positive development, I would think.
Yeah, and it's this weird thing for me. A lot of my pain comes from the purity culture stuff, which may or may, well, it was in the Mennonite polity. So it was a corporate thing, and I don't think that has gone away. And it is kind of this weird, you get this combination of, we're going to be okay with the gays so that we can get them married so that they don't break the other sex rules. So you know, there's so many different ways to do it.
Yeah.
To do theology.
Can I ask, in terms of, since we're talking about theology, we've focused heavily on, women in church and leadership and on purity culture, but what were some of the other things that you would say really, were part of your worldview at that point? And I'm just going to give a few ideas here, but things like angels and demons, the rapture, end times kind of stuff.
Yes.
Anything else that's like, this was a major part of your upbringing to say these are, you mentioned the gospel too, preaching the gospel. Like just what things were on your mind as a teenager?
So my rapture anxiety was back when I was 9, actually. I had read the Left Behind series, and I've written a few things and talked about that. When I was in high school, I was totally into spiritual warfare. I was reading a lot of Neil Anderson, and also Frank Peretti, of course.
Yep.
And I was fascinated by this other spiritual world. I had friends that said they had demons that I prayed with. It was not full-on exorcism. We were just dabbling with little narratives we'd been given. But it was certainly within my vocabulary of describing the world to talk about angels and demons. At one point, I had a teacher in my high school put forth the argument. He used to be a Pentecostal and then also has gone through his own journey and got his MDiv and was the one that taught my biblical exegesis class. I remember having a conversation with him about whether demons existed, and he did not believe they did. And we talked about that for a while, and then I made a same day, I had thought, oh, well, maybe they aren't real. His arguments made sense, and then proceeded to plan an entire Bible study on how demons are real and present it to my youth group. It was just, it was chaos.
With the angels and demons, did you feel like there was any sense that they were literally attacking you personally? Like, not that it was, there's warfare in general, but that they were, like, for example, if you're sitting listening to the pastor and you realize, oh my gosh, I don't remember what he just said, like, for the last 3 minutes. I must be distracted. It must be a demon. Was it like that so personal or?
I dealt with that a little bit more in college. And by then I was still kind of skeptical about the whole demon thing, but I had started voicing all of the dissonance in me. And you can imagine from what we've talked about so far that I might have a lot of dissonance by then. I started articulating these things differently. And so sometimes I'd talk from myself, about myself, to myself, from the I'm feeling this, and respond back with you should do this. And so had these conversations of I, you, and started to wonder if some of the voices were demons and if I was being attacked at the time. And eventually, it didn't take very long because I was in an academic setting to say, I don't think this is actually demons. This is me. These are all different parts of me. And that's what led to my book at the time.
Would you include that? Would you have included at that time that the voice you thought of God or his spirit was potentially you, or was that later?
As I was intentionally becoming an atheist, I made a choice to see it that way.
Yeah.
As I did more reading, and also as I developed my book, I continued to develop that in a little bit more of a substantive manner. I ended up finding a book, my dad recommended it to me, When God Talks Back. An anthropologist goes into a vineyard church and kind of analyzes what that whole setup is. And she takes a pretty moderate approach to the whole thing. She doesn't argue for whether or not it's real, but she does mention that learning how to hear from God is a taught skill, and that it could be described as labeling a particular portion of brain processes as God. And I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. It's interesting too when you think about people who have used different chemical substances to have spiritual experiences, and you think, there's definitely something going on there where we're just using parts of our brain. And I know you're probably going to get into this later, but the idea that this is a system, and you from the earliest days you get those connections wired in certain ways. And I was just talking with my kids yesterday about this. Like you get children to believe that every time certain things happen, like your conscience gets pricked, oh, that's the spirit. Oh, I just did something right. I was obedient right away with no talk back to my parents. Oh, that's God leading me to become a more holy person. And you
Yep.
get those messages hundreds, thousands of times from a young age. You have this system in place where you really do think this is God doing things, and it's really hard to see past it if it's from the earliest days, especially.
Yes. Yeah. And this is why I think theology can be important, because we may experience these phenomena and sensations and whatever we have even after we've left.
Yes.
And as I was concentrating more on spirituality, I kind of got into this of spirituality is more than the experience itself. It's the story you tell about the experience afterward. And when you have a group of people that are in charge of that narrative for you, it can be really dangerous, because you end up kind of gaslighting yourself by the end, because it's not that you haven't had that experience. It's not that like you didn't have an experience with God. It's just that someone told you that it was God. And you get to decide what story you want to tell about that as you mature and become an adult and break off. And it could be that you want to keep telling the story that the community tells. It could be that the story the community tells is very dysfunctional and going to cause problems, and you want to revise it. And all of that is okay. And all of that takes a lot of humility too, because I know my journey to atheism was much more of a practical, functional one than one based on, oh, I just discovered this isn't true. I've never really cared about what's true as much as what's functional. I'm just very utilitarian.
Mm.
And so for me, when I stopped believing in God, it was because believing in God in the way I am currently believing in God is making me suicidal. Ergo, whether or not God exists, this is not going to work. And that's kind of how I got there. So,
Mm.
yeah.
I do want to ask on that note. I know we're moving towards certain high points of the story. How did you transition from the time frame when you were just a teenager being involved in ministry and so forth in your church to actually deciding that you wanted to get an MDiv and so forth? And I know for a lot of people, they you get the warning, even if you're going to a Christian school, that a seminary can be a cemetery for your
Yeah.
theology. How do you like what role did the school play with your thought processes, and did they at all, I guess what I'm looking for is, did they at any point help you in your faith in the sense of saying, were there people you met that were true blue believers, God is God, Jesus is Lord, and he's a savior? Did they help you in your faith at all in those points of the journey, or was it just like, was it academic right from day one, and did that drive you away from it earlier?
Um, I was in survival mode, and anybody that was a true believer was dangerous. And
Okay.
so there was
Can
no way
you
they were going to get to me.
what made you feel that way about it? Like
Um,
what got you to survival mode?
so I guess I should probably tell the story about me and my pastor. So
Yeah.
when I asked to preach a sermon at my home church, I was told that I could not, and I assumed that that would be the case. And what ended up happening was I was offered by a pastor that I was close to. I actually survived youth group playing cards with this guy. I did not like relating to my peers. Um, Part of that precociousness, it just ends up being socially problematic sometimes. But so I had a certain trust with him, but I also knew his theology was not mine. And so I decided to end up taking him up on this offer for him to explain why they decided that I couldn't preach. And we went out for breakfast before school one day and had this conversation. I wasn't planning on trying to change his mind. It was more of a, well, let's just see what kind of shit theology you're going to throw at me now. And I will be amused by how your argument does not hold together. And it started out that way, but then took a turn and said, actually, sometimes women can be behind the pulpit, but not you. Because not you at this time, perhaps, if I want to be gracious about it, that because you have character flaws and we don't think you should be doing this. So some of the wording was, you're rebellious, you don't respect authority, you're leading the youth in the wrong direction. Those are the things I remember. And this tapped into this fear I had talked about earlier of just being who I am hurts people. And so here I was, very, very involved in the ministries they let me do at church. They got a lot of volunteer hours out of me, like talk about unpaid labor. And the response to that was, well, actually, it's threatening how involved you've been. Like, please stop. And there are a few different interpretations I could have to what brought that up, because it was a group of men that observing my behavior that came to that conclusion. And some of them were youth sponsors, and some of them noticed that I was planning entire worship services with the worship coordinator and not them. And so that's threatening. And it's also scary because you think a teenager can't handle it, but I had a long history that they didn't know about. So anyway, there are a lot of things that happened there, and ultimately with that conversation, I came to the conclusion that I was bad and had been sinning and didn't forgive them for other ways that they had upset me in the past, and that this was a reconciliation. And it was so kind of this man to tell me what was wrong with me. And yet I could not get myself to stop crying. And it was this very weird split experience of, I can't get myself to stop crying. Something is wrong. And yet I thought this went well. And so over a course of a few hours, I was able to start putting pieces together and then realize, oh, this man got me to believe things about myself that weren't true, because he used words like God and love and forgiveness. And those are all things I care deeply about because I am a religious, spiritual person. I would never use the word religious at the time.
Right.
And that freaked me out.
Within hours.
That he could make me believe things about myself that weren't true using vocabulary of things that mattered to me. That was terrifying. And it made me realize that nobody was safe, and that anybody that was trying to anybody that wanted the best for me, whatever their best happened to be, could be unknowingly manipulative and harmful to me. And so it made seemingly kind, nice, safe people very dangerous. And it also made religion in general very dangerous. And one of the things that I often thought about was, it's because I love God so much that he was able to do that. It was almost like he was holding God for ransom, and I needed to save God, so I just believed him. And that really shook me. It shook my world. It made everything seem unstable and nothing seem safe. And it was inherently relational. What I recognize now is that it wasn't all this guy's fault. It was the collective community and the system that I was brought up in that primed me to be able to experience that conversation in that way. And that's almost more scary, perhaps. But
was it a situation where they were just saying, if you jump through certain hoops and have certain attitude adjustments, whatever they would have said, that we would let you preach at some point? Was it leaning that way?
I didn't bother to ask.
Okay, so it's just, you're just not fitting the bill right now.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. It's interesting. I can't relate to that obviously directly for the reasons of I'm obviously not a woman, but there's a lot of similar dynamics that I experienced just in the culture in general, where there's just always somebody, there's something that you're doing wrong. And I remember, I've told this story a couple of times, but I remember when I did my pastoral internship at my church, not too far from Philadelphia, I sat down with one of the elders one night, and it was like a Wednesday night prayer meeting, and everyone else was gone. He and I had keys to the church, and real nice guy. We just sat in the back of the foyer and grabbed some chairs and sat for an hour or two and talked. And he at one point said, "Tell me, what is God telling you recently?" And I said, I was theologically already programmed to say God doesn't speak to you; He speaks to us all through the Word.
Mm.
And so, but he was coming from a different perspective,
Mm-hmm.
and I we kind of went back and forth to clarify, and I could tell eventually he was actually saying, no, no, not what is God saying to us all through the Word, what is God saying to you only?
Mm.
And I looked at him and I was like, I don't think I've ever heard God speak to me personally directly.
Mm.
And I mean to tell you, I was like an outsider, like, what the hell are you doing trying to be in ministry and God's not talking to you specifically? And there was a bunch of other little stories like that I could tell, but it's like if you don't, like, everybody had some little twist, and for some people it's like it wasn't that at all. They would have loved my answer. Other people it was like, your theology, are you really a dispensationalist, or are you just like, are you just saying that because that's what everyone else around you has taught you? And eventually became, are you really a 5 point Calvinist or not? And it
Mm.
always felt like there's always somebody in our groups in these churches that wants to say you're not quite right. And I remember years later, I was going to a Presbyterian church, and I ran into this guy who was with the North American Mission Board, which is a Baptist group. And I've wanted to be a missionary forever. And I said, yeah, I think it's great what you all are doing. And I might even, who knows, work for you all someday. And he said, oh, what church are you going to? Oh, Perimeter Church. It's a Presbyterian church. Like, you got to have the message right. And it's like everyone just wants to shoot each other down so much. It really became like a nonstop issue of like dodging bullets.
Yeah. Yeah. And you never know what angle they're coming at unless you can figure it out ahead of time. And a lot of times people don't even know what the name is of what they're espousing.
Yeah.
That was something that I really enjoyed learning in my, but was also kind of disturbed by in my religious education in academia was, oh, there's a name for that. Oh, there's a name for that too. And then all of a sudden you can say, oh, okay, so you're a dispensationalist. Got it. And it makes it feel much less like, no, I've got the message for you. It's like, I know what your message is. It's dispensationalism. There are a few other options too.
Yeah.
Like it takes the seriousness out of it to a certain extent.
Hmm.
Um,
Can I ask, since I did bring up the issue of hearing from God,
yeah.
despite all these issues and red flags going up about ministry, what was going on personally just between you and God, like say in your devotional life and in your bedroom at night? Were you feeling close to God, and how did that work behind closed doors?
When?
At the point of say between your teenage years and when you started to go to school for ministry.
So, mm, yeah. So after I had that conversation with my pastor, it I became very skeptical of my relationship with God being safe. Because
With God Himself.
yes, because God didn't God didn't interrupt what was happening with me and my pastor. And
Hmm.
so I was alone in that to try and figure that out. And now, the way I put it in True Confessions of a God Killer is that God became sick and I had to take care of him. And
Hmm.
that was kind of what happened in my relationship with God. It was this constant, well, you couldn't stand up for me. You didn't protect me. There's something wrong with you. I need to help you. And so it turned into me trying to find ways to change my theology, change my spiritual practices, try and figure out how to fix me so that I wasn't angry at God or scared of God to a certain extent, scared of the relationship. Like I didn't think God was going to come for me at that time. It was more that I thought God couldn't help me in this very, very scary world I just discovered and am currently in the middle of and can't get out of. And
Hmm.
so, and yet at the same time, God was supposed to be my everything, supposed to be my protector, my strength, all of those things. And it was like, until I can get God back to health, I am doubly screwed. And it was very anxious time, and I had a lot of progressive Christians at that point, like trying to make the argument of it's this church was awful. There are other ones. They are not a reflection of God.
Hmm.
And I desperately wanted to believe them because I was trying to work on this God relationship for my own good. And that's ultimately what ended up creating my spirals that made me feel so trapped that I was like, I think I should not exist.
Hmm.
Um,
So
and
you actually became suicidal?
yeah, I mean, it depends on how you define suicidal. I had passive suicidal ideation. So it just became part of my regular thought processes when I started to feel trapped and scared. And it would come down to, well, there's obviously something terribly, terribly wrong with you, and you're a burden, and it would be better if you weren't here. Or that's one version. And then the other version would be, um, I would not be so confused if I didn't exist, kind of a thing. It was all about escaping,
Mm.
escaping an impossible situation rather than having true intent to harm myself.
Not to
But
state, I'm
yeah,
sorry, good. I was just saying,
well,
not to state the obvious, but what a mind job religion can do to people.
yeah, yeah, and all done by people with very good intentions.
Yes.
Like some of the scariest violence we do as humans is the stuff when we're trying to be nice to each other.
Yeah.
Ah,
It's amazing when you delude yourself into thinking you're doing something for a god,
yeah,
and you think you're on the right side of history and on the right side of this specific situation, and you're basically his spokesperson. It's like you can do a lot of damage
yeah.
quick.
Yeah, and when you think you know what somebody needs and you think you know what they're going through, like what I've learned through both my pastoral training and my coaching training is that you need to get a lot more information about what people have tried, what they're experiencing, and really they're going to be a much better judge for many of the issues they're dealing with than you are. You have such a limited understanding of what is going on in that body over there.
Mm.
Um,
Well, can I ask just for a baseline? These are very unique aspects of your story that I think a lot of people don't ever get to this kind of topic with me
yeah.
in sharing their story. But I do like to ask, though, going back to the gospel,
Mm,
were you still at a spot there where you believed that you were a sinner who had a problem that God had taken care of through Jesus's death and burial and resurrection, and that with His blood atonement, as the perfect Lamb of God, that you were in a right relationship with Him, and that ultimately, no matter what church did to you, and no matter how you responded and didn't respond, no matter how much you felt like you wanted to live or not, at
hmm
the end of the day, the biggest issue was settled. You're right with God through the cross of Christ. Was that there, or was that shifting too?
That actually shifted in middle school. I'm kind of glad you brought this up because I haven't really thought about this or talked about it. I had a substitutionary atonement shift in middle
Hmm.
school. I was going to say crisis, but it wasn't a crisis, it was joy. In middle school, I was walking around having conversations with my friends about whether or not Adam and Eve eating the fruit was actually a problem, or was it all part of God's plan from the beginning? And maybe in order to mature in a relationship, you need to be able to make your own choices. And that was middle school.
Hmm.
um, so
That's awesome.
yeah, yeah. Um, so, and then in high school, same teacher that I keep bringing up that was getting his MDiv while I was in high school presented us with three different atonement options, and we talked about them thoroughly. So I knew what substitutionary atonement was. I also knew what the kingdom victory atonement. We were going for the kingdom of God. Jesus is the victor over death, that kind of thing, rather than the ransom model.
Right.
And then I also was given the Jesus is a model for how we live our lives. And this is actually a much more practical thing.
Hmm.
And by being in relationship with Jesus, like if you want to get into the spirituality aspect of it, by being in relationship with Jesus, it makes it more possible to live out the Sermon on the Mount. And so I was much more a Sermon of the Mount kind of Christian by the time that I was in college and even by the end of high school. In my mind, in my body, I was still stuck back in hell world.
Hmm.
And it wasn't necessarily that I was mad at myself for not believing in substitutionary atonement, but more that I just needed to do things correctly. Like there was a perfection issue. I needed to do things the right way. Otherwise, I was going to ruin my life and hurt other people.
Hmm. When you mentioned substitutionary atonement, a lot of us get the clear message who grew up in that part of it and that interpretation of it that I mean it's presented as a very good story, just like Noah's Ark. Ark is ironically presented as this wonderful story. The boat and the animals, let's ignore the millions of people drowning. But with the gospel story, it's presented positively. Jesus loves you enough to die in your place and he wants you to be in heaven.
Mm-hmm.
But when you really get into it and you really start to think through it, at least, when you're a little older, you're getting the clear impression you are so bad
Yeah.
that Jesus had to die for you. And I think too, like we didn't really have statues in my, denomination, but Roman Catholics and other denominations actually would have statues and pictures. Some of them very graphic, where you're seeing the Roman
Hmm.
guard, poke him with a spear, and the nails and so forth, and the crown of thorns. But you get the impression very clearly you're so bad that God had to do this, and if it hadn't been Jesus taking your place, you would have needed to have been tortured in some way. And it's even presented very clearly as in many circles, as if you were the only human who'd ever done like it. Say you were Adam,
Yeah.
and God only ever made you, and He never gave you a partner, and you sinned. He would have had to do it just for you, and He would have done it for you. You're that bad. And of
Hmm.
course, when you look at the again the statues, you are the reason that this man had to be tortured. The torture was your fault, effectively.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
again, it's even presented a second way where you become a Christian, and they say whenever you sin, it's like you're nailing the nails
Yes.
again
Yep.
harder.
Yep.
But when you get that in your psyche, you're responsible for torture.
Yeah.
It does something to you. How did
Yeah.
how
What a terrible thing
how did
to
that
tell
play out?
people.
Like you mentioned your body. How did that play out with the body aspect of it?
Well, a lot of it was me not trusting my own experiences because it does come back to what you're saying. Like, there's something inherently wrong with you. You're a terrible person, and all of these horrible things have to happen in order to make you okay, which means that they're all your fault. Just by existing, you have caused, like, no wonder people experience suicidal ideation with these things. It's like, wow, my existence hurts people. My existence causes other people to get tortured. Like, yeah,
And it
goodness.
offends the God of the universe.
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was operating in me, and a lot of it had to do with I was trying to discern all kinds of things. I was in college trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life. I was healing from significant wounding from the church, trying to figure out what does my relationship with God look like now. How do I want to do this in a more progressive, like my college was known as Go Sin College by some people because
Mm.
it's just academically sound. It's a little bit more progressive. There's actually some history with the Mennonite colleges with that, but anyway.
Mm.
And so in the midst of all of that, trying to figure out like what do I do? The answer is always, well, don't do what you want. Like you can't trust yourself. But if you've lost the connection with this God that was supposed to give you all of that instruction, how do you function? Um,
Mm.
so yeah, that definitely came into play, and then that created the spirals and the traps of, well, I have to make a decision, but I can't because I can't trust myself and I don't have access to God. But how do I? And then it just goes.
How did
Um,
your parents relate to all these dilemmas? Did they help? Seem like they were helpful in talking through some of it? Because from what I know of your other interviews, you paint them in a way that makes me think that they were fairly loving and fairly reasonable people, and
yeah,
that makes me think that there may have been a little bit of a better situation than people that just said, "I can't believe you're thinking these things. You're really,
no, they
offending
weren't like
us
that.
too."
Yeah, I didn't really share a lot of the details with them,
Okay,
and so that
why
they
was
knew
that?
I was struggling, but they didn't know exactly what was going on in my mind,
Were you
and they
afraid of
actually
talking to them
did.
about it?
Um, Well, they actually did at one point. When I was getting really bad, I went to the school counselor that was available, and she talked to me for a while, and I went through all of my little mind games with her, and she was like, I can't help you. You need someone a little bit different as a therapist, as a counselor. See if you can get someone to pay for you to get counseling with someone else.
Hmm.
And referred me to someone else. And of course, I was a college student. I had no money. So I asked my parents if they would be willing to pay for that, and they did. And that was a major support at that time. So it wasn't as much as a conversational thing as it was financial support for getting help from others.
Hmm.
Uh, yeah.
One of the things I've heard you talk about a few times, and I appreciate so much, is just the idea of agency. Did you
Mm.
feel like you were through these situations that your voice was being, suppressed and your agency was being diminished, or did you feel like there was I mean, it almost seems like from an outsider's perspective that there was like a mixing, whereas situations were trying to squash it, but almost like a volcano has lava underneath it. It was like you were finding a way to
Release
eventually
it.
make it much, much stronger, like maybe quiet it down for a little bit. But is that fair to say?
Yeah. Yeah. Me writing my book was a big version of that. That I kept trying to describe my situation to other people where I was at, and they just could not understand. They thought I had a doubt problem. And I was like, no, I just am really, really scared of everything, but particularly things having to do with God and religion and how I'm not doing it right. And so over time, then I ended up just saying, well, somebody has to write about this, so I'm going to, and wrote my own story. And what was really meaningful in that was that there was someone willing to publish it. So
Hmm.
and actually, like one of my pastor's mentors that came a little bit later heard that I was writing this book and said, oh, well, you should get in touch with my publisher friend, and gave me their information, and then
Nice.
proceeded to publish the book. And this was still all within the Mennonite circle. Um, and all of that, like the whole spectrum of, yeah, your voice is worth being heard. I'm going to publish this book that you wrote when you were 20, versus please don't preach.
Hmm.
It,
But
yeah.
the book, you by the time you wrote the book, you had not yet fully left Christianity. You were still working through it.
Yeah, I had killed God. That was how I described it, of intentionally becoming an atheist, of this isn't about me losing my faith, it's me intentionally getting rid of it. And in the midst of that, the people that came around to support me were offering more mystical approaches to spirituality, spiritual direction, this bigger, hey, doubt's okay, and it's actually a normal part of your spiritual journey, and we're here to support you through that and not shame you.
Hmm.
And so the book comes out. I had some people respond to the book from other areas of my life saying, but you didn't figure it out at the end. And I was like, yeah, that's how that goes. And they were a little bit like, but no, we want your systematic theology now. Where is it? And I was like, well, God turned into a zombie, and that's actually part of myself. I don't know how to help you with this. Um,
Hmm.
so, so yeah, that was one outlet.
It seems like in some ways there's this interesting mix where there's certain people in the church that are willing to, I don't know if the word is relevant, but they're willing to entertain the fact that there are serious issues in theology and in our culture and in church culture where like they want to work through these things and other people just want to
Mm-hmm.
write it off and be like, if you're not strictly adhering to the straight and narrow, which usually has many different variations, but their particular straight and narrow, then you're a bad person, and especially if you're leaning towards agnosticism
Mm.
or horror of horrors atheism, that you're kind of at that point in their minds, to so many of them, relegated to you may not have been a Christian in the first place, so we're not, and
Mm.
you kind of get boxed into like, why are we treating you as if you're a Christian who needs to have your faith restored? You're actually a pagan who's never actually been one of us. um,
Mm-hmm.
how did they, I mean, it's it seems like your Mennonite group had a little bit more freedom for some very open discussion, but how were you treated as you began to move towards agnosticism and atheism?
I was given a mic. Um,
Hmm.
Part of it was because the person that published my book was also the president at a Mennonite seminary and invited me to come speak. And a
That's
lot of
amazing.
it, yeah, yeah. Like they're very open to doubt is a normal and real thing. I went into pastoring as an atheist knowing that many, many pastors doubt and it's normal and it's okay and actually means they're probably a good pastor. And I
Hmm.
and and that is the beautiful side of progressive Christianity that's a little bit more interested in spirituality than doctrine, and this idea of what does it mean to practice narrative, ritual, storytelling, and witnessing each other's lives outside of the need to have a dogmatic thing being what unites us. What if we
Yeah.
unite around practice instead of doctrine? And that's what I believed in as a pastor, and still kind of do now, even though I'm totally out because the system is just messed up. But one of the unique things about Mennonites is the emphasis on community. And so one of the things that I latched onto in my atheism for my mental health, at the time I kind of considered it as a sort of disability of, I'm just not able to believe in God and not be suicidal. So I'll let the rest of you do the believing in God for me and be in community with you, and together we'll make each other whole. And that's beautiful if it works, but it doesn't all the time. Um, and so And part of that is just that not everybody is there. And if you have fundamentalism in a system like that, it will eat it. It's the nature of fundamentalism. It will win, because it has to be the strongest bully in the room. So,
Good way to put it.
yeah, so it's, so one of the things that really got me into pastoring as I matured was the idea that making meaning with groups of people and honest storytelling about what's going on in each other's lives and routine gatherings and singing and storytelling and food, all of these things are really good, healthy human things, and it's worth doing them together. And the way I saw that happening for humans was in church settings. Everything else kind of became performance. You go to restaurants, you don't do potlucks, you watch people sing, it's just a very different, our culture does not have as much of that community gathering, though I'm starting to see more of it now as I have been out and have other expressions of it to find. I have to find it now.
Yeah.
I can't just make that argument that it only happens in church.
It's interesting. You're reminding me of an interview I did quite a while ago. Do you know Sasha Sagan? Have you heard that name? Carl Sagan's daughter.
Yeah, I am aware of the role and name, but have not
Okay.
gotten into her stuff yet.
Well, she wrote a book that I'll put a link to our interview for anyone that wants to go check it out after this. But her book is basically about the idea that even though she's also an atheist, that she's like, your life becomes meaningful through rituals that you create as a society, and it doesn't mean that they have to have a meaning in some, eternal or connected to a god.
Yeah.
But it's like they still bring you together, and I think she talks about certain holidays and obviously birthdays and marriage and children and death, funerals. But those things can bring meaning, and I think in some ways it's almost like a challenge for those of us who've left to say, just because we're not going to do it the religious way anymore, that doesn't mean we've got nothing. Like in some ways, that's a big challenge, I think, for those of us who are trying to be proactive in talking about atheism, is to say, what do we have to give to the next generation? Because we don't want to just create a vacuum. We want people to feel like there's something more. And I know there's people like Jerry DeWitt who actually would create like a atheist church. I'm not sure if whether or not those are the right way to do it, but just to say there's the rituals of life can bring significant meaning to us in the midst of a lot of loss of this God figure that we thought was real.
Yeah, absolutely.
With you doing this, when you get to a point where you're actually an atheist, were you shunned at all?
No. It wasn't like there was nothing super public about it.
Okay.
And I was also during that time doing church internships, and I told my supervisor I was an atheist, and she was like, "Oh, okay. We're going to get you into spiritual direction, but like I'm not worried. This is normal. Part of faith process." And
that's so different.
Yeah, and so much of it is self-imposed, because I don't know in some of the conservative areas where I grew up what would have happened to me. They would have all probably tried to help me. I don't know. But yeah, no shunning. More of a I will quietly not mention my beliefs and let people assume what they want from my practices and actions. And that was how I pastored as well. If somebody had blatantly asked me when I was pastoring, "Hey, do you believe in God?" I think it happened once or twice, and I said, "Sometimes." And and I was committed to being honest about that. But what often happens is that people use pastors for whatever projection they need.
Yeah.
They don't often want to actually know much about their pastor.
That is so different. And I honestly am having trouble wrapping my mind around that kind of community.
Yeah.
In the groups I was with, they would have skinned you alive and crucified you, and you would have been treated as a traitor, very much, and shunning as well as very vicious attacks.
Similar to my previous fears, when I was pastoring as an atheist, the main reason I wouldn't want to tell someone about it would be if they were the kind of person that would then think that everything I did for them as a pastor didn't count. Like I have worried since I've left pastoring, because I'm on the internet, they can find me. Most of them aren't that internet savvy, but they might be now with the pandemic. Do they think that the baptisms and the funerals I did didn't count? And to me, that's a pastoral care fail. And that would be heartbreaking. And I would be sad for both of us on that. Because I do think they count, but I also know that you can't just make someone believe that. And what does counting even mean? So there was a lot of shame in my atheism, in that there are people who are fundamentalists in this church system. And if they find out that I don't believe what they think I should, they're going to be afraid and scared and hurt and betrayed. And I'm scared of hurting them. That was the main fear, as opposed to they're going to reject me and punish me. I was more scared of that for the sex.
I would think too, there'd be the thought in a lot of people's minds if you could mislead the children. To me, that's such a big issue.
Though if you have like barely any children coming to your church, it's not as
yeah, that's true.
if you're small and dying enough.
Can you define or talk about the idea of compassion fatigue? Just what is that, and how did that play out in your world?
Yes. So compassion fatigue is a combination of two things: burnout and secondary traumatic stress. And it's something that anybody that works with humans that have gone through crisis, are describing crisis, or you're witnessing the crisis yourself, can be prone to. So a lot of us. And in my experience with it, it's been really enlightening to get this training for myself, because for a while I thought it was just my main religious trauma that caused me to burn out while pastoring. What I'm now realizing is it was secondary trauma as well. And it was also burnout, which has to do with how do I perceive my environment. And if you start out with a really scary perception of your environment going into any kind of work, the way you perceive your job and your tasks and what it is that's being asked of you and what you have control over is going to be very different than if you go in with a more positive worldview. So just having been through a toxic religious environment, I think would make people more prone to burnout. But for sure, one of the things I realized as a pastor is that a lot of people think about secondary trauma related to major crises, people getting in accidents, people going through cancer, people going through abuse, like that anybody witnessing any of those things, that's where the secondary trauma shows up, or people in the hospital, in the emergency room, whatever it happens to be that they're coming in with. And with pastors, there are two big things that I noticed for myself. The first was I didn't believe any of the theology when I was a pastor. By then I had deconstructed all of it and was kind of looking at everything from a functional, practical perspective of how is this story helping or not helping you? And if it's not helping you, how can we finagle some changes in here so that you are a little bit more functional with this? But I did have congregants that believed in demons, and I did have congregants that believed that God was going to strike the church down with lightning if we married a gay couple. And I did have congregants that believed that there was a real problem with me not doing altar calls every Sunday. And they weren't all the congregants, by the way. This was probably like even a smaller group than the majority, but it was enough. And they're the ones that get concerned, of course. And so you interact with them a little more. That I am witnessing people believing violent things about the world, about God, about how spirituality functions. And that is heartbreaking, but also translates back to me, because I am now pastoring in this community, similar to what I said before, well, exactly what I said before of, I'm not worried about me being an atheist. I don't think that it's putting me in danger, but I am worried what it's going to do to my people. Yeah. And that's secondary trauma. That's saying there's threat from this thing that I'm not afraid of, but have been told stories about. So that's exhausting and puts our bodies into threat response a lot of the time. And it made me afraid of myself. So I was my own trigger for my entire pastoral career with that. But then in addition to that comes the burnout of, I perceive my environment as not giving me enough resources to meet the demands I perceive being put on me. And that came through a variety of ways. One of them even being like my whole debacle with the premarital sex thing of, it is demanded of me that I follow all of these rules or else. And really, I have seen other pastors have different ideas about the morality codes of their churches and not freak out about them. Like it's not a career crisis. It's like, no, we're at different points here, and I get to be a person as well as a professional, and there's a line. That was not how it worked for me because of what I had grown up in. And so I didn't get to have that line. And I perceived a bunch of demands on, well, every fundamentalist in my congregation is a demand for me to look like I'm living the way they think I should. And that's just, you can't do that. You can't do that, especially if you have this whole spectrum of different ways of doing Christianity all in one little building of 30 people.
Are you
Um,
meaning like if you were to have had sex outside of marriage, that they would have disqualified you from ministry, that kind of thing?
yeah, yeah, that was a big fear haunting me. Part of that was because I was hypersensitive to it because we were going through all of our sex rules at that point because of the gays.
Hmm.
Um, and so LGBTQ, I use these terms in sarcasm. Um, but I, yeah, so I was imposing a lot of, the polity was there. It was real. I wasn't making stuff up, but the reality of what was going to happen to me, like what a relief that their pastor with short hair that is single is straight. Like I feel like that would have been, like, I was in a much better position than many other pastors that are LGBTQ and have to keep that a secret from their congregations. Um, but because of the stories I was telling myself, I was experiencing pretty severe symptoms.
Hmm. I was curious. One of the things that I think we would agree on is the idea that when you get to a point of deconverting and you escape, um, you look back at it and you think this stuff was really toxic. And
Mm-hmm.
specifically, that the God character that I was taught to believe in and maybe even preached and passed along was really an abusive tyrant. And I joked about the Noah story, but Noah's a really good example.
Yeah.
Murdering children, animals, all of them. And even though that's not historically accurate, it's like we were taught to believe it was, and that this was all very much deserved. And you add up everything from, you mentioned Adam and Eve, how this God character is willing to put a snake that or let a snake come into his garden and ruin his perfect plan.
Mm.
And the idea with that became part of my story was the idea of the genocides of the conquest of Canaan. You're allowed to go in and tear down these people's cities, kill the men, kill the women, kill the boys, kill the babies, but the young virgins, keep them alive for yourselves. And you realize through all these things, stoning women that aren't virgins, beating or having slaves and beating them. Eventually, you're like, okay, these aren't just things that this God allows passively and says please don't do it, but I recognize you will. Some of this stuff, a lot of it, he's actually commanding. This is what I want you to do. And you realize, and this, I'm just touching the tip of the iceberg there, but you realize this is an abusive tyrant. And then when you bring in the bigger picture of the gospel and hell, I know people interpret that differently, but you're like, okay, so he loves you so much that if you don't love him back, he will slaughter you and torture you eternally. And have you seen that Dan Barker video? You don't have to come in my basement in my house. Dan Barker does this great job where, if I could just take a minute to summarize it, he paints this picture of this guy walking by a house, just on the sidewalk, and some guy starts yelling to him, "Hey, you don't have to come in my house." And the guy's like, "What?" And I think it's, "You don't have to come in my basement." And the guy says, "Yeah, I've been yelling to you, as you've been walking by my house. I've been yelling to you to come in, and I've been so angry that you haven't come to my house." And I've been so angry that actually in my basement, I made this torture chamber, with saws and knives and tar and fire. But you know what? I, I sent my son down there instead. So you don't have to go down to my basement, but you can come live with me. We can go live in the attic. And it's like this guy, if you were, or if you were to paint it more the picture of just like a relationship with a husband and wife, this is the guy who says to his wife, "I love you so much and I want to be so intimate with you. But if you don't love me back, I will beat the shit out of you forever." You'd call the cops, obviously, even if it was just a threat, and for sure if he actually did it. And yet, that's the God that we're in many ways. I know not all denominations would agree with that description, but for many of us, that is exactly what we were taught to believe. Pictured very differently, but when you get down to it, that's exactly what this guy does. He's an abusive tyrant. Did you did you feel like that was part of how you saw God at any point, and if you did, why do you think other people can't see it? Why do you think that you go into these worship services like, oh God, you're such a loving father, a good daddy, and it's like, wait a second, he's a good daddy who does genocide. What? Why aren't you seeing the disconnect?
So yes, I do identify with that. I remember one time I was in college processing all of this. I had killed God already, and we were watching Sleeping with the Enemy, and it's a Julia Roberts movie. She's in a domestically abusive relationship and escaping from it. And at the end of the movie, I had recommended it. I liked the movie, and they were like, "Why do you like this movie? Like, what is wrong with you?" And I was like, "I just sometimes I feel like my relationship with God is like that." And it was a weird conversation to have at the time. Um, but it, I want to make sure I answer your question. So stop me if I get a little bit too far off track. But one of the things that I think about, some people just don't believe it, I think. I think they have a good enough foundation for their lives, whether it's from parenting growing up and they're not as deep in it from the beginning. And so by the time they get in it, they're like, well, that's ridiculous. I'll just take what's helpful and believe the rest. But other people, it can depend on personality, it can depend on life experiences, it can depend on a lot of different things. But like what we know about trauma is that it's the response, not the event. And so you can't just assume that the same thing happening to every person is going to result in the same response. And some people will be coming out of that with trauma and others will not. And I think that's the case for religion too. And it's something that we need to keep in mind in the atheist community, as far as we assume that it's always going to be like, I don't want to assume that my experience is what everybody else's is with religion. I need to be diligent enough to understand that even if it is not rationally or logically true, it can have a function that is very different than what I experienced for other people. And it's good for me to investigate that before I assume that I know what's best for them. Like, same deal with my own situation with the Christians earlier. And what I wish more progressive Christians that didn't have all of this awful theology clogging up their bodies from earlier would not assume is that you can just fix it by changing your theology. Because like a lot of people would listen to your stories about Old Testament God and say, well, that's Old Testament God. I have a whole solution for you. I thought it all out. Read these 5 theologians and you've got it covered. And it's like, my body's not going to care. My body has already been taught about this God, and that's what it believes in, and that's what it has adapted to over time. And so I've spent 7 years studying theology. I know my options. And I know there are some absolutely beautiful options in the midst of that. I am still living in my body. And even if I find the most beautiful theology that solves whatever problem, it may be that I'm just not really into the Christian thing from day one. It's just not my style, for lack of a better way of putting it. It's not my orientation spiritually. And so that means that maybe I just don't want to do it because I don't want to do it. Like, you don't have to defend it to me. It could just be, not my deal. But in addition to that, if you really want to be, if you do have people that are like, actually, I really want Christianity to work, but my body believes all these terrible things, and you want to be hospitable to those people in other religious spaces, it goes beyond just having better theology. You have to condemn fundamentalism, because otherwise they're not going to be safe. They'll superimpose it onto their experiences. It's similar to what I did in my pastoring. I superimposed what I knew. I superimposed the rules I thought my community would get me out of a job for. I, to this day, do not know what would have happened if I had been totally open about what was going on with me personally, which ultimately wasn't anybody's business anyway. And so I think in the more progressive areas of religion, which I recognize isn't necessarily our audience, it is really important to, if you're really going to tackle this and try to be healthy, you have to openly condemn fundamentalist theology in order to create safety. If you want to be tolerant and open to everybody, you will lose the traumatized people because they just can't. They cannot inhabit that space healthfully. You just can't be open to everybody.
It's a good way to put it. It it is interesting to me to see how many people I've observed who do go to that more liberal version of Christianity as a safe place, or to at least a version, some kind of quasi version of spirituality where I think, and this is just my conjecture, so I don't mean to be judgmental, but I think a lot of people just really can't deal with the idea that you get one life and it's truly over when it's over.
Yeah.
And the idea that there is no actual judge and there is no actual ultimate standard and so forth, that there has to be some meaning to it all. And I get it, and I should ask on that note, did you struggle with the idea that you might not live forever at a certain point, and how do you deal with it now?
Not the way a lot of other people do. I remember when I initially got rid of God, I kept asking myself, would you be okay dying today? Are you happy with your life? And surprisingly, I was. um, and then I kept adding more experiences and was like, wow, yeah, now I'm even more happy. Like, I feel good about this life I've lived. I'm good. And I know that is not how a lot of other people function. So it didn't become as big of a deal for me. I don't know if it was because I experienced so much suicidal ideation that I was thinking about dying all the time anyway, or it's just my
Hmm.
temperament or what it happened to be. But I think about dying as being restful.
Yeah. Do you
Um,
think if you could have lived forever, would you have wanted to?
no,
No. Hmm.
I don't think so. Um, yeah, I was never really that excited about heaven.
Okay. Like, does it seem boring to you, or
Yeah, yeah. I was much
one
more
more chorus, one
hyper
more chorus?
focused. Yeah, right. Which, hey, I'm a musician, but even so, um, and also the people you'd be hanging up with up there, golly.
Yeah.
Um, mm, but yeah, I think I was much more hyper focused on hell, and I don't know whether or not those cancel each other out. Like you pick one, you focus on that, or not. Yeah,
Hmm.
but
Yeah, I don't think it really hit me too, the idea of the narcissism of the Yahweh character. Just
mm,
the idea of, we're gonna stand around his throne and sing holy, holy, holy and cast our crowns down, and we're just gonna keep doing it forever, and we're gonna find new ways to, just say you're so beautiful, you're so amazing, you're so lovely, and we're so unworthy, but you're so, you're so provided for us. And like
yeah.
the non-stopness of that, like this guy is so narcissistic. It's
Yeah, the
unbelievable.
only thing that makes that appealing is the fact that it's the only alternative to hell, really.
Yes. Yeah.
And then in that context, it's like, oh, this is great, but is this a choice? This is terrible. I would rather just be like not existing than doing this.
Yeah. But it almost becomes like a Stockholm syndrome effect. Like,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I'm glad I'm here, but it's just because I've been, psychologically brainwashed. Well, I know we've talked through a lot of your part of your stories. I did want to just ask a couple of final questions. And then also, if there's any parts of it that that we skipped that you want to talk about, feel free to bring them up. I did want to ask about people who are just starting this journey that maybe they're nowhere, they're not, maybe they found this interesting, but they're like, I absolutely believe Jesus is still real.
Mm.
How do you carve out a safe space to just investigate and think through it without feeling like you're going to disappoint the hell out of everybody that is your spiritual mentors and your friends, and how do you, or just how do you interpret that, and how do you create a safe space for yourself to not judge yourself and say, uh-oh, this is my pride speaking. I just don't want to bend my knee to the Lord, and he's the master. I just want to put myself on his throne. And you mentioned, trusting yourself, Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. I'm leaning towards trusting my own judgment as opposed to trusting the word of God and the Spirit. It's touched so many of these stories from what I've experienced in interviewing people. It's an issue of like bravery, of like how do you just start it, because it feels like
Yeah.
you're just so many ways that you're going to condemn yourself to just do even a little bit of it, even touch the fringe. You feel like you're becoming heretical, basically. How do you carve out a safe space?
The first thing that comes to my mind is finding safe people. And that's going to be a little complicated depending on the person and what community they're in. But if there are even just more progressive, like this is why progressive Christians matter. They really like we need to not shit on progressive Christians because they can really help.
Yeah.
Because they can give you just enough space without being too scary to start exploring some stuff, and you can still have the safety of the tradition, and you can still have the vocabulary that is comforting, and yet also have a little bit more room to start asking questions. And you can hold these people at the same time as staying in whatever community you're at. Like as anybody that leaves an abusive relationship, you want to have a plan and you want to have a support network before you leave, because it's going to be hard.
Yeah.
And so starting to venture out into spaces that have people with a diversity of perspectives, and then starting to strengthen those relationships, is going to be really helpful for when things start to get more and more, oh, actually, yeah, I do think I'm ready to leave. And to be able to leave into a community instead of only out of one is majorly going to help. When I stopped pastoring, I had a whole bunch of friends that were not Christian at all. And part of that was my strategy of having a support network as a pastor. And because I wanted people that weren't congregants, so I didn't have to be on the I'm taking care of you train all the time for them. I needed to get care back, and I needed to not be asking that of my congregants. And that, I think, made my transition so much better than it could have been if it was, I have no one. And so in the moments when you are brave enough, that can be a really good step. And also forgive yourself when you're not, because this is something that has been, your body has adapted to this environment. And so it's doing its best to protect you. And when you are too scared to venture forth that way, do what you need to do to ground yourself. And then when you notice that bravery coming back, start looking for your people. And that can be online, it could be in your community, it could be coworkers. Though I don't know, that might get complicated, but but just knowing, like, who are my people beyond having this one thing in common?
It's interesting first answer, because it's for people that are aware that they're deconverting, you have the time, but mine was very quick. I would have looked back and said I was moving toward it and I didn't realize it. Mine occurred over the space of literally 1 hour. It just the chips just suddenly fell. It was like someone chained me down in front of a fire hydrant and opened it up, and it just blew. And within an hour, I was fully out. So I didn't know I needed a new community. An hour before, I would have said church is my community. Yeah. But it's, if you have any sense of prescience that this is coming, or not that you're coming, that you know you're going to deconvert, but just that there's some serious questions. I completely agree with you. Find the safe people to ask those questions, and they could still be Christians, just safer Christians than the fundamentalists who will just condemn you and say you're just being belligerent to the gospel or to God.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the other thing personally, when it comes to doing that work, is this is easier said than done. Giving yourself permission to trust yourself, and I'm going to follow that up with, might as well start paying attention to your body now, because it's going to be a long process and you've probably been dissociated from it for a while. So if there is any way that you can give yourself the permission to even pay attention to what it feels like to hold a mug in your hands, you're going to get so much further than if you're trying to think yourself through everything. Getting in touch with just sensations, they don't have to be thoughts, and starting to pay attention to when your body is tensing up and how it's responding to certain things is going to give you a lot of information that is going to, and skill that's going to be really helpful when you need to desensitize later.
Good thoughts. My last question was, as a coach who deals with people going through some of these kind of situations, is there anything that surprised you or shocked you over the last couple of years, where either about people's journeys or just about your response to helping them and watching them heal, and hopefully heal, hopefully at least move to a less toxic environment? Is there anything that's kind of shocked you, and or something you would say is an interesting lesson you've learned as a coach?
The first thing that's coming to my mind is when I went to one of Marlene Monell's support groups for the first time and encountered people talking in a cadence that reminded me of evangelical churches. And it wasn't necessarily what they were saying, it was the manner in which they were saying it. I was like, oh, right, these are church people. Like, I expected everybody to be these stone cold rational atheists, and I forgot that we are used to being in community with people in a certain way. There can be a certain cadence to it. There can be a certain expectation of what it means to show support. There can be some amening and preach it and all of that kind of stuff that still shows up. And I simultaneously, like, that shocked me because I was expecting the cold rational atheism. This is often the picture churches will paint of people that have left too. That either they're like, they left for the sin. I guess I left for the sin, but they left for the sin, or else they're just like cold rational materialists that have no meaning or joy or poetry in their lives. But no, that's not it. This group of people, we are at least previous church people, and that can mean good things and bad things. It can mean that we can still be just as dogmatic if we're not intentional as before, with just different content. Like, our bodies are used to certain processes and we might replay them, so it's important to pay attention to that and not expect it. And actually, I knew this cognitively, but because I hadn't spent time in the circles, I forgot that, like, the atheist world can be just as sexist and racist as the church people. Like, you got to figure out your values for yourself and not expect that just because somebody left religion that they're going to hold the same things valuable as you do.
Yeah, very true.
But also that there is something special about people that have in their bodies this, oh, I was in a community once. I witnessed the lives of other people regularly once. And there's something, I think there's a different kind of longing for people that have already experienced that than people that never have. And I think that that is really hopeful, because for the people that want to build alternatives, it's worth tapping into that. And that goes beyond just getting therapy. That's, who are my people? How do I develop ways to be in community with others that are conscious of the trauma or toxicity I've already experienced? Because that knowledge and experience and sensitivity is a major gift. So you mentioned at one point one of my bucket list things. One of my bucket list things is to gather a bunch of people that have left toxic religion to figure out how to do music as a community without needing to sing about God or dogma. That is one thing that I miss the most. And sometime in my life, I would like to make that happen without a need for performance.
What a great thought.
Yeah. So anyway,
are you musical yourself?
Yes, I was also a music major, so I did vocal.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
But Mennonites also, at least MCUSA Mennonites, have this weird tick in which we show up singing 4-part harmony sometimes. And oh man, can you imagine the somatics of that? Like, when humans sing together in groups, their heartbeats sync up. There are functions to these things much beyond manipulation and dogma, for sure. And I don't think we should throw them all out.
Yeah, for sure. That's awesome. I did say last question. I'll add one more. What's the next thing for you? What's your next part of your adventure or journey or efforts?
Well, the big thing that I'm doing right now is developing my compassion fatigue side of things. So I have a little bit going on with my religious trauma. I've got my support groups are starting to run now. This has been the first 6 months I've been able to offer those.
Those are courses people sign up for, and
yeah, and they're very skill based of learning how to do self-regulation and safety grounding, safety assessment and grounding, and then also doing it in a group with others, and skill oriented storytelling and stuff like that.
Is some of that in person as well?
No, not yet. I don't know if I'll. Yeah, that'd be interesting. But anyway, the other thing that's new for me, I just got my compassion fatigue consultant certification, and so I'm learning how to contract with businesses to come into organizations and train, and do training as treatment for workshops, but also work one-on-one with people to start the recovery process for compassion fatigue and develop resilience skills going forward. And that's broader than religious trauma, though. Religious trauma certainly comes to play depending on who you're working with.
That's awesome. I love how you're taking your skills and broadening it out to a bigger base. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I know I asked a lot of questions. Is there any part of your story or anything you wanted to add before we wrap up?
Nothing is coming to me at this point.
Gotcha. It's always one of those things where as soon as we hit the end record button, something pops. Oh, I should have said this.
Yeah, right.
I'm that way with there's some movie. I was going to quote this movie. What was it? And the minute I hang up the phone, I remember what it was.
Yep.
Anyway, well, I just want to say to wrap up, thank you so much for being willing to share your story. It's a lot. You're very open and vulnerable with your story in a way that I think is helpful to people who are looking for that. Obviously, we need people who are willing to tell their story, but also thank you for being willing to be public about it, because I know a lot of people, have good reasons to stay under the radar, but I appreciate your willingness to share it publicly. And just thank you too for being willing to help people who are on this journey with your, coaching, because a lot of us do need to, talk to people one on one. I do want to hopefully we've implied that here, but if those of us, anyone who's watching, it might not be enough to just watch some YouTube videos of atheists talking about healing. Like, you might actually need to talk to somebody. So we obviously encourage you to get the help that you need. But thank you for being willing to be a voice in this, and we definitely appreciate it. And I look forward to hopefully touching base with you again sometime.
Yeah, I appreciate the conversation. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Emily.